In the United Kingdom, as in many countries, workers from some ethnic groups get paid less than white workers. How can we close what's become known as the ethnicity pay gap? Welcome to Roundtable. Hello and a very warm welcome to the programme from me, David Foster. If you are black, Pakistani or Bangladeshi, at least in this country, you are likely to get paid less than a white person. The same goes for black and Hispanic people in the United States. But some groups, such as the Chinese, get paid more. What has emerged is an ethnicity pay gap.
The UK's ethnicity pay gap has been revealed for the first time. Official figures show significant differences between what people earn depending on their ethnicity. Workers from Pakistani and Bangladeshi heritage have the lowest median hourly pay for any ethnic group. The median pay of white British workers last year was equivalent to $14.99 an hour, compared with $12.46 for people of Pakistani ethnicity and $11.96 for Bangladeshis. Campaigners are calling for regular equal pay audits for ethnic minority workers to get a full picture of the problem. However, the report also found white workers had a lower median hourly pay than workers from Chinese or Indian backgrounds. This ethnicity pay gap exists in other economies too, so how long will race dictate how much you get paid?
Delighted to say that joining me at the round table we have Alonge, founder of the Equal Group. We'll hear what that is in just a moment. Simonetta Longhi here, Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Reading. Priya, Shah here too, who pushes for more diversity in the property sector through her group, BAME in Property. And we cross the United States. Dedrick Asante-Muhammad joins us from there, Chief of Race, Wealth and Community at the National Community Reinvestment Coalition. Now, that was quite a mouthful. We have a lot to say, so let us crack on. Simonetta, first of all, this is not just about pay, is it? It's about other things too.
Yes, exactly. So we know that some ethnic minorities are paid less than white British people, at least in the UK. And a lot of the researchers actually found that what is important is occupations. So despite sometimes having quite high level of education, minorities don't seem to end up being able to end up in good pay occupation that pay well, but seem to get stuck in low pay occupation. And that's part of the reason why we observe this.
Well, we will go into why certain races fare better than others, Chinese and
Yes.
Indian seeming to do pretty well. But tell us a little bit, Priya, if you would, about your experiences in the property sector before you founded this group called BAME.
Sure. So I think when I started my career about 4.5 years ago, I think part of my personal growth and development was to, attend lots of networking events and, just to try and get involved in the industry as much as possible. And I would attend networking events, and it's very disappointing to often see, 4 white men on a panel, and everyone always says, but you might get that diversity in thought, but you're just not getting that diversity in thought when you've got people who've generally had the same education, same university degree level education as well, and same career experience as well. You're just not getting that diversity in thought. And so I would sit in events not feeling very interested. And I think when it came to attendance as well, you just weren't getting that diversity in attendance. And it's very difficult to walk into a room. It's very intimidating, especially when you're in your early 20s as well, to just go up to someone and say, hi, come and chat with me. Nobody really wants to do that. Nobody really wants to break that circle. And I think just in my project teams and my client teams, it just wasn't very diverse.
But pay comes into this as well. And Dedrick, I'll come to you in just a moment so you can reflect on what's happening over the Atlantic. But pay does come into this as well, doesn't it? Quite seriously in terms of the differentials.
I think pay is a big issue, no doubt. And I guess within the UK, there's a lack of transparency around pay. So who's paid what are the reasons for people being paid such substantial figures? And also in terms of progression. So people from a certain demographic tend to progress a lot quicker than those from other.
Why would you guess that a Bangladeshi worker in the UK gets 20% less than a white worker, but a Chinese worker gets more than 30% more than a white worker. Why? And Indians as well, 12% more than the white worker. Why?
Yeah, so it's not just a straightforward answer of this is why. There's kind of a multiplicity of issues here. So one of the issues that was mentioned earlier was actually the occupations that people tend to take up, as well as the progression within those occupations, as well as the confidence gap. So sometimes as a minority, it's a little bit more daunting to ask for a pay rise, or there's a lack of a track record of people within your position from a similar demographic getting paid a certain figure. So if you're the first one in a role, it's harder to ask then, or to be as demanding as other people that have got track record of
Okay,
being
I'm
in
going to
those
ask you
positions.
in a little while what it is that you're doing with your groups to try and change this. But let's go to the United States. Dedrick, do you recognise what you're hearing here and believe the same sort of thing is happening, but with different faces in the United States?
Yeah, no, I do see a lot of similarities, and I'm interested to know if in England, if we have data over like multi-generation. I think a great challenge for the United States is we know that African Americans are kind of being stagnant in terms of income inequality as it relates to white Americans. I think one thing we understand is that it's quite easy to understand why some groups in the United States, some Asian groups are doing much better than, say, Blacks and Latinos. And it's those who immigrate to the United States with a high education level or high skill level do well in our progressive economy. That's been the greatest challenge in the United States over the last 40 years. We have such a regressive economy where poor and middle class people are constantly losing ground to higher income. So immigrants who come here with high skills or in higher occupations, higher income occupations, seem to be doing much better.
But that's to be expected, isn't it? If somebody comes to a country well qualified, they're more than likely going to get a better paid job than somebody who isn't. But I heard you mention this about sort of intergenerational things, and I think the fact is here in the United Kingdom, from what I've understood, if you are second generation immigrant, you are much more likely to do better. Now that does show that there are opportunities, Simonetta, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, when we talk about the pay gaps, we need to be mindful, because what we are saying is that as a group, blacks are paid less than whites, not necessarily that they're paid less for doing the same jobs.
Yeah.
One important thing is that in contrast to the US, in the UK, say half of the blacks are immigrants and half are born in the UK. So if you're an immigrant and you come even with high level of education, sometimes it is hard to get it recognized. So you might end up accepting a job which is lower than the one you would have accepted otherwise, just because people don't know the school you went to and those sort of things. The second generation does much better because they're born here, they're educated here, they have the right networks, although there's some issues there too, but they have they don't have the disadvantage that their parents had to some extent.
Dedrick, I would invite you at any time to jump in on the conversation, not feel excluded, because we're talking principally about the UK here. So do feel free to do that. But I'm going to ask Mac first of all, if I can, to tell me a little bit about your equal group, because you were working in the energy sector.
Yeah.
You saw some of the issues that Priya had seen, which was that you didn't feel included. Yeah? And you were there for quite a while. What are you trying to do now to change this?
So I worked in the energy industry for the best part of 10 years, worked for different size organizations, so large organizations, big four consultancies, etc. And during that time, there's a very much a boys' club culture at the top. So when you look at kind of the senior managers, senior leadership, executive level, they kind of pass between roles very easily. And touching on what was said earlier about kind of the cultural implications of being either first generation or second generation migrant, you tend to learn the system a little bit better. So learning what's done, learning how to approach things. So things such as negotiating a pay package. If you're new to this economy, if you're new to the UK, you wouldn't necessarily understand the nuances around how to go about negotiating your pay. So I think it wasn't just, my experience didn't focus just on the pay, it was also around how I felt treated in the organisation. So how did I see my prospects? So staying within the energy industry would have been quite frustrating for me, because I looked up and I didn't see anybody like me at the leadership level.
And you wanted to help other people too. So what did you do?
Yeah, so essentially we started the Equal Group. looking at the ways in which we could support organisations that had a desire to be more inclusive and had a desire to be more diverse.
So this is actually not just looking at the individuals, it's looking at the organisations as well.
Yes.
And what do you say to them?
It's conversational. So it's about what are your objectives, what are your aspirations in terms of how you see your organisation developing. A lot of that is to do with the leadership team as well. So recognising that there is a distinct lack of diversity at the leadership level, and that kind of feeds on to why there are some issues around pay, because it's leaders that set pay, it's leaders that set cultures and ways of working within organisations. So they have a huge responsibility in this.
Priya, I will come to you in just a second. I know you're dying to say something,
Absolutely.
but I sort of half invited Dedrick to jump in and then I stopped him. I'm terribly sorry about that. So what is it you wanted to say?
Well, I just want to put forward, I mean, I think it's been brought up several times in the conversation that it's much more than an income gap. I think it's much more holistic. It's economic inequality or racial economic inequality or ethnic economic inequality that then, that's related to issues of education, of social mobility in country. We've been focusing a lot in the United States on wealth inequality, racial wealth inequality, and how even when you have income inequality, there's very big differences in wealth, which oftentimes means challenges around financial security. So just want to highlight, I think it's not just income gaps. People are saying it's occupation.
And it covers so much of it. What Mac seems to be suggesting is that it's not just individuals you need to empower, you need to educate organizations. And do you recognize that sort of thinking where you are?
Oh, yeah, no, definitely. I've done some work with the NAACP on opportunity and diversity report cards, looking at major corporations, major industries. And again, too often we're seeing very little advancement over the last 30, 40 years in increasing diversity numbers. And, that's a big challenge here in the U.S.
Priya, carry on, please.
Thank you. Yeah, so I set up Bayman Property to help the property, planning, real estate sectors to bring more ethnic diversity to our sectors. So we know that 14% of the UK's population is from an ethnic minority background, but a survey taken by EY and the RICS in 2016 found that only one.
These are property industry bodies.
Yeah, so the RIC is the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, found that only 1.2% of the built environment sector is from an ethnic minority background. So it just already shows that huge disparity. And if we are trying to serve the population that we are actually building for, we're trying to create diverse and inclusive communities. As a sector, we're just not representative of those people. And if you look into London, over 40% of London's population is from an ethnic minority background. You look at some of the London boroughs, such as Tower Hamlets, Harrow, Ealing, Brent, I could go on, but they are so diverse and they have very particular housing needs. So there are some ethnic minority groups, such as Indians, Bangladeshis, Pakistanis, who have more intergenerational living. But most of the housing that we have today is very much, studio flats or just 1 or 2 bedroom flats, which doesn't really accommodate for cultural and differences in housing and living needs for different ethnic minorities. So it's not just important for the recruitment side of why we should have more diversity, but it's also better to have better planning outcomes and better planning delivery, which is what the purpose of
And what sort of changes, if any, have you seen since you started this?
I think we can definitely see a cultural shift in the industry. I think as soon as Bayman Property came into the industry about a year ago, or rather a year and a half ago, it was just supposed to be a networking group. We would have a few networking events a year, and where people would come together and we could discuss some of the challenges that ethnic minorities were facing. But I think it really, really did just take off. And in the last few weeks, we've been evolving into an organization where, some of the top companies are really actually saying we are going to start making some positive changes, have an actual cultural shift, and tackle some of the issues which are impacting our industry.
There was a report commissioned a few years ago. It's called the McGregor-Smith Review, all about this, Dame Ruby McGregor-Smith. And if you follow up, because it was 2 years ago, on the reports that have been written about this, and then the reports that have been written about the reports that have been written, there are so many great intentions out there, but has very much changed? I mean, one of the things she says is we need to stop hiding behind the mantle of unconscious bias. Has that happened? Or are we just into a talking for talking's sake phase?
Well, it's important to start talking, and hopefully something will change from that. I know that a lot of firms now have unconscious bias training to help people at least recognize that they might have some bias, even if it is not willing. I'm not quite sure to what extent it is working. I think at the moment it feels a bit like a tick box exercise. We need everybody to have the unconscious bias training, so everybody knows about this. But
so it's cosmetic at the moment, and it needs
exactly,
to go
it doesn't come from the workforce. Oh, I really want to know about this issue. People are just sent to
how
the training.
Do you make it worthwhile in terms of change? I know one of the things, Mac, that you're interested in is for companies to be told to collect data, figures about what the ethnicity pay gap actually is. They're not obliged to do so at the moment.
Definitely. And I think for me, it's touching on from the tick box point, it's very redundant to do training about something that everybody acknowledges. So it's not a stretch of the imagination to acknowledge that growing up in a certain environment, being educated in a certain school, having friends from a specific demographic will limit how you see the world. So unconscious bias isn't a new concept, and just focusing on the training aspect doesn't solve the problem. So you can tell somebody that you have a bias against a particular gender.
How do you change it?
It's about process and procedure. So unless you make organisations more transparent in terms of what's going on. So
this is partly to do with reporting what the pay gap might be.
Yeah, to some extent, but it's also wider than that. So at the moment, companies don't even track data in terms of ethnicity. So a lot of organisations limit their understanding of data to male, female. They don't move on to ethnicity, they don't move on to religion, they don't move on to all of these other protected characteristics. So it's about actually making organisations essentially remove the mechanisms for people to enact their bias in the workplace. So if you've got a recruitment process that is completely closed off, completely black box, that nobody can see into, nobody can interrogate, there's ample room for people to employ their biases on that process.
Okay. What do you do to get...
Please,
Dedrick.
Yeah, I think it's one thing we've learned with corporations in the United States, that if corporations really care about this, they have to actually get the data, right? I mean, they have to be business-minded, right? When they're doing their business, they have plenty of data, they're tracking, they're seeing how their profits are going up or down. If they care about diversity and inclusion, then they should have that same type of data and really be motivated to actually make sure there's increases, right? You can have many programs and not have much progress. So the programs aren't the answer. It's actually having a business-minded approach to strengthening diversity.
It is not mandated by law here that you have to have that. I think you would all at this table probably like that to happen. What is the position in the United States about transparency?
There is EEOC data, which is data that...
Equal opportunities.
But oftentimes they aren't even reflecting on the data and don't even know the data. And so again, I think it's less about mandating and much more about companies say they're for diversity and inclusion. Well, you can't just say it. You have to take action on it. So if you're for it, I don't think there's anything in England preventing them.
No, but they have to be held accountable either by their own moral backbone or by law, don't they? And is that happening in the States?
No, it's not happening to the extent that it should. Again, the reports we've been doing shows that there's been very limited increases in diversity, particularly at higher levels or procurement over the last 30 years. And so,
Priya, the same thing here? I mean, we know it's not mandated by law, but are companies showing an increasing propensity to do this?
I think so. I think there are some companies which are actually trying to give us that information more voluntarily as opposed to mandatory. And I think as soon as you make something law, I think companies are far more compelled to do it. It's all about naming and shaming. That's what pay gap reporting is all about. We saw it with the gender pay gap reporting, and I think we will see it with the ethnicity pay gap reporting. I think one of the biggest issues that we will face with ethnicity pay gap reporting is just data collection. How do you collect this data? I think it's not as binary as gender, which is male, female, or whatever, but I think with ethnicity, it's far more nuanced. I think just to begin with, some people are very reluctant to even disclose that information about their ethnicity or their religion because they already feel like it's a disadvantage before they've even entered into a company. So how do you actually encourage them to give that information?
That's catch-22.
To actually say, but we want to use it so that we can help you, so we can try to reduce
We're not being
the
intrusive.
ethnicity.
We're trying to give you
pay
help
gap.
up the ladder.
Exactly. I think, some people think that their name is going to be a hindrance just before they enter into an industry or where they've been educated or their socioeconomic background. Usually that comes hand in hand with ethnicity. It's going to be so complex, and I think different industries do need to come together and just start sharing ideas and best practice, because
Dame Ruby said the government had to make this law. Is there any movement towards that? She said daylight is the best disinfectant. The government must legislate to make larger businesses publish their ethnicity data.
I think it's important, because what we know at the moment about the ethnic pay gaps just comes from the country as a whole, so people working for different companies, different jobs, and so on. What we don't know really is within a company, why are minority pays less than whites? And if this is the case, why is it so? Is it because there's no recruitment, there's lack of career progression? And we need to know the sources of this pay gap within the firm first.
Is it only about the lower paid end of the wages scale, or are we also talking about the higher end? That would, obviously there are fewer opportunities in your opinion, but is the pay gap still, is it right the way across the board?
Well, we don't know, because we don't know information from the firms. So it is possible, exactly. I mean, that's why the reporting of the pay gap, of the ethnicity pay gap, would be really useful in this sense. And especially because I think for large firms who want to do the right thing, who want more diversity and so on, unless you start collecting the data and thinking about what is going on in your firm, you're not going to know if there's a problem and how to solve it.
This is what I'm hearing from each and every one of you, is that we need to have more information to be able to make it possible to effect change.
Yes.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, going back to Dedrick's point, the forensic side of things, with which people go into financial details and accounting and that kind of thing, shows how seriously they take finances. So we need the same level of attention from people that say that they're interested in diversity and inclusion.
Yeah, you see, people perhaps might be saying they're interested in diversity when in fact they're quite happy with the status quo, because it keeps them in the lifestyle to which they've become accustomed.
Absolutely.
And doesn't mean that they have to share it around quite so much.
No, they don't.
So
But
how do you persuade them?
I think, we all know that it is morally right to have more diversity and to make sure that people are paid equally for doing the same job. But I think in order to get business leaders actually listening to us, we really need to start using the sort of financial and the business case for it. So research by McKinsey & Company has shown that companies which have more ethnic diversity at the executive boardroom level outperform their competitors by 35%. So it's quite a significant figure, and I think it does go to show that what you get is that diversity in thought. And you are having more ideas being shared around, you're having people who've grown up in different parts of the world, have experienced different working cultures, all putting their ideas to the forefront of the agenda. And I think that is so important for any industry to thrive, and I think especially property and real estate.
So actually it's staring them straight in the face, isn't it? It would affect your bottom line to the better.
Absolutely.
If you actually make changes like this, rather than actually taking money out of your pockets and putting it in somebody else's. You think it would work that way?
Yes, I mean, I agree.
So McGregor Smith says the reward is huge.
Yes, there's a lot of academic research also suggesting that team in general, when they are more diverse, they perform better. So, there's always a gain. It's difficult to challenge the status quo, though, because if there's a board of 3 people, 3 white male, either you increase the board or one of them has to go.
Yeah. So, Dedrick, how do you bring about real obvious change such as that? Because if people are entrenched, it takes a lot of persuasion.
It takes a lot of persuasion. I think, though, there is constant opportunity. Like, I understand that there's a board of 3. Oftentimes, the boards are larger than that. Usually is some type of turnover. And so I think if companies are saying they're committed to this, then they have to make sure that they are actually moving the ball forward with each opportunity transition. The one argument we make, or at least I make, is much less about that the company will make more money, but that you don't want a society that is marked by deep racial, economic inequality, deep ethnic inequality, particularly in a country, I think, as the same in England, where there's a growing segment of the population that are of people of color. And it's not a healthy thing to have a growing segment of the population be so economically insecure. So this is why this need to help advance these efforts that the whole country needs to be embracing, or else we're kind of you're going to be more like the United States, where you have an ongoing, really racial economic apartheid with very little clarity as to when it will end. We're on a path of ongoing deep racial economic inequality in the U.S., and hopefully that doesn't have to be the same in England.
Okay, so Priya, it would appear from what each one of you is saying that it's a win-win situation. You just got to keep pushing.
Absolutely, I think we do. And I think when future generations enter any industry, one of the key things that they are looking for is that diversity. It's that cultural diversity. I think you can always give them the highest pay package in the world, but if they don't see that there is diversity, that for them sets the tone of the culture of the company. And I think that's why you're seeing lots of young people sort of moving around jobs frequently. They're sort of going off to do their own thing with the startup and startup culture. But I think that's what future generations want. So I can see it happening in the future, but we need to start making those changes from today.
Thank you so much. Dedrick, we appreciate you getting up at the crack of dawn in Washington, D.C. To the three of you, thank you so much for coming in. From me, David Foster, thank you for watching. You can find us on the TRT World YouTube channel. That's Roundtable at TRT World YouTube. From me, for now, goodbye.